protesters were known as conscientious objectors, that it was moral or against their religious beliefs to fight in a war, so they didn't want to go. We also have something students would respond with what would be called doves and hawks. And if you were a supporter of the war, you became known as a hawk, and if you didn't support the war, you were a dove. Alright? Oh, sorry. Let me go back there. Sorry about that. What happened was both doves and hawks would be criticized by the president for they would criticize the president for handling the war in Vietnam, and what happened is because of this, his approval rating went down. In October of 1967, as the opposition to the war mounted, there were these large demonstrations. More than 50,000 people marched on the Pentagon, and they just protested the war. And then in 1968, it would just be a year of major events. One of the most significant years in our country's history. And it all starts with Tet. Okay? January 31st, 1968. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese would launch what was called the Tet Offensive. It was a major offensive that attacked all major military bases and South Vietnamese cities. They would raid the United States Embassy in Saigon, and they also struck in Hue, which was the ancient capital in Vietnam. It would turn out to be a major disaster for them because after a month of fighting, the American South Vietnamese soldiers drove the enemy back, inflicting heavy losses. But in the United States, the Tet Offensive turned more Americans against the war. People were shocked that the enemy that was so easily beaten could do this to our country, which would just lead to political problems. Johnson faced many challenges in his own party, with Eugene McCarthy, said that he would run for president. Robert F. Kennedy, brother of John F. Kennedy, he was going to run, and it didn't look good for President Johnson. Now, 1968 was, like I said, a very, very troubling time. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, a sniper would assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who led the civil rights movement. The assassination of King would lead to riots all across the country. So, while the nation is arguing at home, and there's major unrest at home, the race for the president picked up speed. Vice President Hubert Humphrey joined Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy in seeking the Democratic nomination. Then in June of 1968, Kennedy and McCarthy would face off against each other at the primary election in California, the state that had the most delegates. On that very night that they were competing against each other, Kennedy would win, and an assassin would follow him into the kitchen area and kill him. Just another assassination the country had to deal with. Now, the Democratic Convention would be held in Chicago. Thousands of anti-war activists would flock to Chicago to protest Humphrey's most certain victory. Okay? Now, people would march on. They tried to march to the convention site. Police blocked the marchers, and then began to pelt the officers with sticks and bottles. The police then threw tear gas in and charged in, wielding nightsticks. Right? They pursued all that flocked from the scene. Humphrey would win the Democratic nomination, but the violence that was shown during this time would not do well to help his credibility. So in the election of 1968, most people, didn't want the fighting to happen anymore. They opposed the violence that was happening in Vietnam. They opposed the violence that was happening in our country. And they wanted a return to law and order. Now, Richard Nixon, this man right here in this picture, he would say that he was appealing to the silent majority who wanted law and order and did not protest or demonstrate. He was going to appeal to those working class folks in our country. What would happen? And he would get the win, and Nixon would become our next president. Now, he would go and try to change tactics. He hired this man, Henry Kissinger, right, and they would try this new form of peace with honor, and it had 3 parts to it. And Nixon is quoted by saying, "We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another, until we speak quietly enough so that our words can be heard as well as our voices." This peace with honor, what was going to happen is that he believed that we needed to take steps, Nixon this is, to end the nation's involvement in the war. The first step was going to appoint this man, Henry Kissinger, who was a Harvard professor, and he was given total authority and to make decisions, to use his diplomatic skills to end the war. So he had this policy he called linkage, and it improved it aimed to improving relations with the Soviet Union and China, the suppliers that aided North Vietnam. Right? He wanted to just cut back their help and end the war. Right? So we had a number of steps that we wanted to do. And the first thing that we were going to do was going to change, the selective service system. We were going to give South Vietnam more responsibility in the fighting and expand the bombing campaign until hopefully the North Vietnamese would surrender or just work negotiations with us. So, the selective service would change. College students could no longer obtain deferments. 19 years old, you could be called in service of Vietnam. They would be chosen by a lottery that would be based on their birthdays. Again, protests against the draft faded with the reforms because the government began calling up fewer young men and because Nixon promised that to eliminate the Selective Service Act. So, what do we need to do here? Alright, we had Vietnamization. And Vietnamization is a plan that called for South Vietnamese to take more control over their situation, over